Should we talk about Ceuta? Last week, the Spanish enclave of Ceuta in North Africa was overwhelmed when 60,000 migrants tried to cross the border from Morocco. The line of the Spanish government, Jacob, is that this is all sorted. Everyone has been either voluntarily left the enclave or has been pushed back into Morocco. There's nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. Do you buy that line?
Yeah, well, I think it's remarkable and indeed outrageous that this has become the story, and the story not just of the Spanish authorities, but of the EU as well in general, and also of plenty of the media figures that have kind of latched onto this. Because for one, it's hardly as if this was kind of no big deal. The fact that the people have gone home after engaging in one of the kind of largest and most brazen acts of border violation that we've seen in recent years, that the fact that can just happen is worthy of serious reflection in and of itself. The degree to which this kind of the Spanish state was almost complicit in inviting these people in, all of that desperately needs to be analysed. And then at the same time, it doesn't appear to be the case at all that everybody has simply returned home and that the Spanish authorities have quickly rounded up everybody affected. Indeed, most of the on the ground reports that you read suggest that there's anywhere, is probably changing by the day, but there's anywhere up to kind of 5,000 migrants still remaining. Most of them seem to be actually not Moroccan citizens, but people from other parts of Africa and sub-Saharan Africa that came over at the same time of all these of all the Moroccans. And this is because the Moroccans are now refusing to receive back the people who aren't Moroccans. So in a way, this almost seems like a convenient way in which the Moroccan authorities kind of disperse themselves of a load of potentially problematic people that they didn't want anyway, under the cover of some mass violation by the Moroccans. And you've got this like relatively tiny area where there are now 5,000 people have no right to be there. If you look at some of the videos still coming out, literally, I mean, it sounds like overblown, but literally roaming the streets looking for, in some cases, trouble, but at the very least looking for food and shelter. A large number of unaccompanied children among them, although given how we know that the EU struggles to distinguish between a genuine child migrant and someone who's got a full-blown beard, we might be skeptical of some of those claims. But then finally, the whole thing that was kind of the backstop of this narrative around this incident was that, whilst this might be a breach of Spain's territorial integrity, don't worry, because nobody's going to make it to the mainland. Right, even though this area is actually technically part of the Schengen zone, that they've kind of tried to maintain this as the key thing. Just don't worry, we're going to keep them all there at the very least, and they won't make it into Europe proper. But then again, this narrative is also falling apart. Because of the fact that the asylum centres in Ceuta are completely overwhelmed. They've already begun the process of transferring people who were in those asylum centres to the mainland. And whether these are people who came during the mass break-in or people who've wandered across at various points in the past months and years, doesn't matter, because the point is this has resulted in a net transfer of people to the European mainland who have no right to be there. So every single time that they try and put a lid on this, the kind of European and Spanish political elite, every single time they try and put a lid on it, the narrative just completely falls apart. And there's a huge degree of both outright falsification and then an attempt to manage the narrative of well that is really, really disastrous. And we need to get into as well what this really tells us about the EU's border and the degree to which this, as I said at the beginning, is very much invited in by the whole institutional and legal apparatus that has defined EU border security for quite some time.
Yeah, and this comes off the back of Spain regularizing what it expected to be about 500,000 illegal migrants. In the end, it's turned out to be 1.2 million or thereabouts. There's also been Spanish court decisions that have said that anyone who arrives by sea by swimming can't be pushed back, and I think that was something that seems to have instigated this particular surge. And Tom, as Jacob says, people are being invited to come regardless of whether regardless of how many people have been returned on this occasion.
I think that's right. And of course, the immediate spark for this was, as you say, this Supreme Court ruling in Spain, as well as a lot of questions about the extent to which the Moroccan authorities allowed it to take place, ongoing disputes about the status of Western Sahara, this kind of breakaway territory. The politics of that have been sparked for previous incursions, not nearly on this scale, but there was one in 2021, if I remember correctly, about 5,000 people made it over the border. So those are the kind of immediate sparks for the shocking scenes that we saw last week. But there's also the broader context. And I think when Pedro Sanchez first announced this effective kind of amnesty for illegal migrants, you wrote a piece for Spiked Fraser talking about how this feels like it could be another Wir schaffen das moment, the point in 2015 where Angela Merkel, height of the Syrian migration crisis, just essentially invited them to come to Germany. We will manage, we'll sort this out, and then unleashing all kinds of disorder and political ramifications that are continuing to be felt in Germany and across Europe. And what you see is this kind of whiplash that takes place. So you have a country like Spain and indeed a country like Germany, which will posture, which will kind of throw open the borders in one way, shape or form. And then when they're confronted with the consequences of their own virtue signalling, suddenly have to do things which are, from their perspective, quite murky. In the case of Ceuta, sending in the army and the navy and the police to try and get on top of this issue, or of course in the case of 2015 and everything that happened after that, Angela Merkel and the EU having to go cap in hand to Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, chucking billions of euros in order to house Syrian migrants, and also in the process kind of handing him tremendous leverage in his dealings with the EU, because at any point he could threaten to unleash another migration wave on Europe. So it's one of those things where you see this kind of tremendous whiplash that takes place, sometimes in response to just the staggering material consequences of their sort of open borders virtue signaling, but also I think just understandable backlash for the public who are suddenly confronted with, as I say, the ramifications of what it is that their leaders have been doing. And especially with a country like Spain, like, of course, Pedro Sanchez is in post, but he was elected last time around, I believe, on a kind of reduced mandate, a reduced majority. This policy seems to be, largely speaking, a kind of sop to the radical left part of his coalition. Meanwhile, Spain, like many other countries, is roiling on the issue of illegal and legal mass migration, in which, by looking at polls, at least kind of 60% of the country thinks the numbers are far too high. And it's carrying on regardless. He's carrying on like the last 10 years haven't happened. It's caught up with him now, and I think it's going to catch up with any leaders who want to continue to hold on to that sort of fantasy, even with the plentiful evidence of their own eyes showing what terrible consequences can be wrought thereof.
And finally, Jacob, I mean, of course, the problem here is that, you know, it's not as if the decisions that are made by Pedro Sanchez only affect Spain, because we have the European Union. Essentially, every country is beholden to the border policy of the country with the freest restrictions. You know, Sanchez has opened Europe's border, not just Spain's border. And you know, if you're in Poland and you're not happy about this, you can't vote him out.
Indeed, and I mean, this is one of the, I think that the two major consequences of this, but has been brewing for a while, is that the Schengen zone, the free movement zone or passportless zone, which applies to most of the mainland EU, that is seriously being called into question. We've seen the Italian government take measures to reintroduce border checks, but this is something that only kind of builds on the precedent that's already been established by other countries such as Germany and Austria, reintroducing some forms of passport control on the mainland, precisely because, I mean, Sanchez is radical in his kind of pro-migration rhetoric and policy making to a degree that even embarrasses most of the other pro-migrant kind of European elite. So he's a especially radical thing. But he is, in fact, calling into question the entire kind of architecture of the EU migration policy by simply drawing attention in particularly outlandish fashion to how mad the consequences of these policies are. So the whole Schengen area, the passportless travel that we were repeatedly told was the kind of glory end goal of the European Union, that dream is being seriously called into question. And also the other thing I think that really needs some attention, and we talked about this on our podcast and have a few times, is the degree to which the policy of the European Union, who are deeply, deeply uncomfortable with enforcing border control, their policy has always been to outsource the control of borders to other countries, to third countries like Morocco, like Turkey, etc. And they do that because they are uncomfortable with enforcing the border. They don't want to be the ones doing the pushbacks or turning people around or deporting people. They far prefer that kind of dodgy strongmen in other parts of the world, as they would see it, are doing this. But that just means that in the last analysis, the European Union is entirely beholden to these countries who can weaponize it at a moment's notice. And the European Union has completely lost the ability to actually control its borders by pretending this is just a problem that can be managed by someone else. And I mean, we do see in the European Union some small crawling moves towards getting more serious again about border security. And there is an emerging kind of coalition even in the European Parliament, which is passing various bits of legislation to make deporting people easier and trying to give greater powers to border authorities. But this is going to take an awful long time to unravel when the kind of entire direction and architecture of the European Union for so long has been entirely devoted to either pretending that borders aren't a problem or demonizing anybody who tried to enforce their borders, as we saw in the case of Poland and Hungary, who were the subject of attacks and fines and all kinds of legal weapons by the European Union simply for enforcing their borders. And so I think this might be the beginning of a little bit of a change in rhetoric by EU elites, but it's going to take a long, long time. And it's definitely not going to be the kind of work of EU elites like Ursula von der Leyen who actually put an end to this. But when you do have more sovereignty-minded national leaders in place, to some degree, as we see with Giorgia Meloni, but increasingly it will be the case elsewhere. So it can be up to national leaders to kind of capitalize on what is now, I think, an undeniable consensus in European politics that this era of borderlessness just can't continue.